Thanks to a massive publicity campaign and a contagious fervor spreading throughout all of Lord of the Rings fandom, you're probably aware that the first installment of Peter Jackson's new Hobbit trilogy opens this week. I've taken the upcoming movie as an opportunity to revisit the book, which I hadn't read in about 15 years. Like pretty much everyone, I've seen Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, so I'm intimately acquainted with his tendency and sometimes error for length. He'll never do in 2 hours what he can do in 4. So, when I heard that he was spreading a 255-page book out over 3 entire movies, I decided to time myself to see if I could read the book faster than I could watch his films. The answer is yes. And I'm kind of a slow reader. It took me a full 7.5 hours, so I'll still beat Jackson by about an hour and a half, assuming that all of his Hobbit movies are about 3 hours, which all of the Lord of the Rings movies were. But aside from quantifying how ridiculous Jackson's length problem is, I've learned something else in reading Tolkien's classic novel. The Hobbit is weird. It is an odd little book, and to my genuine surprise, I think it's a better book than the entire Lord of the Rings series. First of all, The Hobbit is a book obsessed with language. When I make that claim, some people may assume I'm talking about the runes at the beginning or the fantasy languages that Tolkien created. Certainly, those are indicative of someone who's heavily interested in languages, but they're also fundamentally more juvenile experimentations with language than some of the other things that he does throughout the book. I say they're juvenile because using a foreign alphabet as a direct code for our Roman alphabet, which is pretty much what the runes are, is something every child is tempted with when they learn a new alphabet. And making up imaginary words for things is a common game among children. But let's take a look at the first bit of dialogue in The Hobbit. Bilbo is talking to Gandalf, and he says, "Good morning," to which Gandalf responds, "What do you mean? Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" That is a pretty pedantic response, but it shows Tolkien's deep interest in semantics and ambiguity. Much more sophisticated language hobbies than writing in a direct cipher or making up imaginary words. The interest The Hobbit takes in semantics and ambiguity underscores the entire novel. Bilbo's riddles with Gollum and Smaug are the two most critical turning points in the narrative. In both scenes, Bilbo uses his mastery over language to get the upper hand. By besting Gollum through riddles, Bilbo gets away with the ring that makes him invisible and which would become the centerpiece of The Lord of the Rings. By deciphering the runes on Thorin's map, mastery of language also unlocks the mystery of how to enter Smaug's lair. By verbally sparring with the dragon Smaug, Bilbo discovers the dragon's weakness and how to destroy him. A multilingual thrush then communicates Smaug's secret to Bard, who is able to take the dragon down. Language is the real hero of The Hobbit. This emphasis on language and ambiguity marks a real difference between The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books that followed. The Hobbit is better than The Lord of the Rings anyway, or at least more interesting. And when I say that, the die-hard Tolkien fans always tell me condescendingly, "Yeah, The Hobbit is much easier to read." Yes, it is an easier read. Each chapter is deliberate and furthers the story. There are no Tom Bombadils in The Hobbit, and there aren't nearly as many rambling monologues about irrelevant plot points as there are in The Lord of the Rings. But that's not the only reason why I say The Hobbit is better. The Lord of the Rings is almost entirely uninterested in ambiguity and moral dilemma. Sauron is irredeemably and inexplicably evil. Examining his motives is never rewarding for the reader because there's no depth or complexity to them. Likewise, Frodo is never really conflicted over what he should do, just whether he can hold himself together long enough to do it. The books are almost devoid of any moral questions. Philip Pullman, the author of The Golden Compass, said, "The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally an infantile work. Tolkien is not interested in the way grown-up adult human beings interact with each other. He's interested in maps and plans and languages and codes." That's a little bit harsh, but Pullman does have a point. Aside from Gollum, the characters of The Lord of the Rings have only shallow questions of identity and purpose as they go about slavishly acting out their archetypes. And despite the dizzying mythos Tolkien has piled upon his stories, it doesn't really make the overall tale deeper, just longer. This is not the case with The Hobbit. In the beginning, Bilbo is commissioned to be a burglar. Ha ha ha. At first this seems like a joke, but over the course of the novel, Bilbo turns into a bona fide thief with a moral compass that's hazy at best. In his final act as a burglar, he fully steals his friend's most prized possession and then gives it to an enemy army. A betrayal like that should give any of us pause before the execution. Bilbo is fundamentally a much more interesting character than Frodo. And the whole purpose of going on this expedition is built on some pretty shaky moral grounds. Does the acquisition of wealth justify all the deaths in the book's last battle? Not to mention all the innocent people who died in Lake Town during Smaug's attack. Bilbo certainly raises this question. But for all of the Hobbit's exploration of linguistic and moral ambiguity, it still promotes some pretty troubling worldviews, even if it is in a fantasy world. I think it's a little silly to call Tolkien racist because of how he talks about his own imaginary races, but the books make broad generalizations about characters based entirely on their race. At the end of the book, a recurring sentiment emerges. You can only trust dwarves if money hasn't entered into the equation, even with an otherwise honorable dwarf like Thorin. While I don't know of any dwarves who would be offended by what's said in The Hobbit, because, once again, they don't really exist, there is a problem with ascribing character flaws to an entire race. Another puzzlingly dated philosophy in The Hobbit surfaces when the humans pick their king at the end of the novel. The good people of Lake Town had previously been ruled by a sort of elected bureaucracy until a guy named Ward kills Smaug, and everyone cries out at once, "Well, shoot, let's make him king. He totally killed that dragon." So that's what they do, and they live under more happiness and prosperity than they ever had before because they now have a dragon killer as their king. Even assuming monarchy is better than elected representation, which is a big concession, is marksmanship the best criterion for civic leadership? I think The Hobbit's conflict between modern moral examination and antiquated ideology comes from Tolkien's unique position between modern and ancient worlds. He was a veteran of World War I, the incubator of modernism, but he also spent his professional career as a professor immersed in ancient texts. Tolkien's contemporary and colleague, C.S. Lewis, spoke of his own spot in the shifting historical landscape. In his inaugural lecture as the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, Lewis spoke of how valuable it would be to speak with an antique Athenian about ancient Greek drama. And then, acknowledging the radical shift that was taking place in the West, Lewis said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you somewhat as that Athenian might stand." He correctly anticipated that he was one of the last men of a dying era, an era that would be swallowed up by modernism and postmodernism. The Hobbit is also like that ancient Athenian. It serves as a guide into much older paradigms, while still being accessible to modern readers. But I wonder how much of this, if any of it, will get translated into the movies. All I know is Peter Jackson is certainly taking enough time to do it justice.